There's just so much in this gospel. I've decided I'm going to do something a little bit different, and rather than give you a 3 or 4 point sermon, whatever, what I want to do is kind of walk through this gospel and tease out the sermon that is in it. So let's begin with, when was the last time you asked, why doesn't God do something? It's a question that we all ask. We ask it when we see something horrible happening to others. We say it when tragedy strikes our own lives. And this question is hanging over the opening verses of the story of the raising of Lazarus. Jesus is told that Lazarus is sick. He waits 2 days. Why didn't Jesus do something? Now, there's a kind of response, it's indirectly, I'm teasing it out, a response to our question from Jesus. Well, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of Man may be glorified through it. And John, well, in the New Revised Standard Version, the translators have added the word accordingly, I think, in order for us to understand that John thinks that we ought to know why he's waiting. Accordingly, Jesus stayed put for 2 days. Huh? This is typical John. I've said a few weeks ago that in the Gospel of John, there's always more there than meets the eye. There's the surface level to the story, the words that we read, but there's almost always 1 or 2 or even 3 layers of meaning behind it. And the clues for the meaning are sprinkled throughout the Gospel and even in each story themselves. Now, the first thing we have to do is we have to keep in mind this. Whether it's this story or some other story, this story of the raising of Lazarus is not about Lazarus, it's about Jesus. That's our first clue. And then another clue comes in verse 8. When Jesus' disciples are concerned that he's going to go to Bethany. And they're right to be concerned. In the previous chapter, Jesus had been in Jerusalem, and the Jews had tried to stone him for blasphemy. So, as John tells us, Bethany is only a couple of miles outside of Jerusalem. It is all but certain that someone is going to see him and hightail it to Jerusalem, to the temple, to tell the authorities where Jesus is. Thomas thinks that's a foregone conclusion. Let us go that we may die with him. And so the news of Lazarus has given Jesus a moment of pause. He seems to understand that if he goes, it will be the last time. And to see that, all we need to do is draw back and see this story within the larger gospel. In the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the event that precipitates Jesus' arrest and crucifixion is the cleansing of the temple. But in John, it's this, the raising of Lazarus. So Jesus waits 2 days. Jesus has to pray to discern God's will. Should he go? Is this the right time? Is Lazarus to be the final sign of the 7 signs that John has pointed out along the way? Is this the last one? And if it's the last one, is it meant to be a sign that is supposed to point to Jesus' ultimate fate? And if that's true, then Lazarus needs to die, and he needs to pray that his Father will raise him up. So he waits for 2 days. But meanwhile, people like Mary and Martha and all the other people who are watching Lazarus die are asking, where is Jesus? Why doesn't he do something? There seems to be a lesson in here, too, about what we ought to think about such questions, or at least how God might address these kinds of questions. It comes when the disciples ask him, why in the world are you going back to Bethany? I mean, it's almost like, are you out of your mind? Surely the Messiah is not meant to be arrested. And Jesus gives this cryptic response, right? Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble because they see the light of the world. But those who walk at night stumble because the light is not in them. And recall again from a couple of weeks ago, I said that here's this theme of light and darkness that runs throughout the gospel again and again. Jesus is the light. And perhaps John is saying that sometimes our questions, where are you, God? Why don't you do something, God? Are emerging from darkness. Now, darkness isn't evil per se. It depends on the context in the gospel. And here, it clearly means a lack of understanding. It seems that even the people who followed Jesus closely were deeply puzzled by him sometimes. So Jesus seems to have meant that the only way to know where you're going is to follow him. If you try to navigate with your own understanding, you're going to fall because you're in the dark. But if you stay with him, if you trust him, then even if it means days and perhaps years of asking why nothing seems to be happening, you'll come out at the right place in the end. So Jesus heads to Bethany. Before he gets there, Martha catches wind of it, and she runs out to meet him. You know, remember Martha? She's the doer, right? She's the busybody. She's the doer. I think she's going out there to confront the man. Where have you been? And what she says to him is, I'll paraphrase it, if only you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Now that's another one, right? When was the last time you said, if only? You know, it's that awful sense of wanting to turn back the clock. That nostalgia, not for the past as it was, but for the present that could have been, if only the past had been different. And all of those feelings are present in Martha's if only. And the dialogue that follows that is astonishing. Because what Jesus does is invite Martha to gaze into the future. And then he challenges her to imagine that future coming to meet her in the present. Remember, a couple of weeks ago I talked about this is the Christian life, anticipating the future. Here and now. The future life that we will have one day, we start living here. So first, Jesus points Martha to the future. Your brother will rise again. Martha knows this. That's actually standard Jewish teaching. Martha understands that Jesus is referring to the last day, the day of resurrection, when heaven and earth will finally and once and for all be united, and there will be no more pain, there will be no more death, no more grieving. And she believes it. Yes, I know he will rise on the last day. And then Jesus invites her to see the future that is already bursting into the present. I am the resurrection and the life. In those words, we discover deep meaning that John wants us to see. The future that she waits for isn't just an event. It's a person, and he's standing right in front of her. Jesus is the resurrection. We're all familiar, right, with incarnational language, like Jesus came from heaven to earth. There's even a song like that. He came from heaven to earth. Yeah, that's it. But we could just as equally say that Jesus has come from God's future into the present. By inviting Martha to see the future and imagine it here, I think he's also prodding her to change her if only to if Jesus. If only you had been here. If Jesus is who she's coming to believe he is. If Jesus is the Messiah. If Jesus is God's only Son, the one in whom the living God is strangely present. If Jesus is resurrection, in person, life come to life. And you can fill in the blanks to all of those, if Jesus. I think we're given an invitation here as well. I think we're invited to take our if-onlys and where the heck have you been, God? Right to him. Why didn't you come sooner? Why have you allowed this awful thing to happen? But we need to be prepared for an answer might be something like, well, there are 12 hours in the day, and I'm the light of the world. Follow me. That's really not a very satisfying answer, I grant you. But what John wants us to believe is that if we can do that, if we follow him, God's future will come rushing to meet us in the present. And as the story unfolds, these if-onlys and why didn't he do something continue to hang over the scene, and one that is now turning into profound grief. Mary and the people around town who are with her are weeping. And as Jesus sees it, he breaks into tears. Now, theologians over the centuries have offered all kinds of explanations for why Jesus wept. And a very popular one is to say, well, this points to Jesus' humanity. See how he had real emotions for his friend Lazarus. I think that may be true as far as it goes. I have three things to say about Jesus weeping. The first one is actually something that came to me earlier this week, and it's related to the question of, is this trying to somehow express the humanity of Jesus? And I got to thinking, Jesus waited 2 days. Yeah, he was discerning the Father's will, yeah. But then he's confronted with the cost of waiting, with the grieving and the wailing of women all around him. And he's brought to tears. I wonder if in his humanity, if Jesus may have doubted himself, even if just for a moment, did I do the right thing? Is Lazarus dead? Maybe if I had been here, I could have healed him. Now, whether there's any truth to that or not, let me just say, it's really beside the point. It just won't do to say that this is somehow only about revealing the humanity of Jesus. And at any rate, the one thing we can say is that no one who saw him at the time saw anything other than a flesh and blood human being. Something else must be going on, which leads me to the second thing I want to say. The important thing is, what does John want us to see in Jesus weeping? Remember how it began. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John wants us to see something far more mysterious and compelling than whether Jesus was really human. When we look at Jesus in tears, John wants us to see the Word in tears. The Word, who created everything that is breaking down and weeping at the grave of his friend. About this verse, this is verse 11:35, shortest verse in the might be the shortest verse in the Bible, but it's definitely the shortest verse in the New Testament. In the Greek, it's simply Jesus wept. And about this, N.T. Wright wrote, "Only when we put away our high and dry pictures of who God is and replace them with pictures in which the Word, who is God, can cry with the world's crying, will we discover what the word God really means." What's the meaning of the word God? Jesus wept. To paraphrase Isaiah 53, verse 4, the Word has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. But the third thing to say about Jesus' weeping takes us to an even deeper level of meaning. That Jesus is weeping for a death still to come. I don't think there should be any doubt that John is drawing a straight line from verse 11:35 all the way to the cross, on which Jesus will be bearing the pain and grief of the whole world. How could Jesus not weep? The Word made flesh is overwhelmed by both grief and fear. And then we come now to the opening of the tomb, in which presumably Lazarus has been cooking for 4 days. And I really kind of mean that. The climate in that area is hot and humid. It certainly would have not been good to open the grave, open the tomb. Jesus knows that if this is the event that sends him to the cross, then Lazarus is alive. But I don't think even Jesus knows that yet. Martha, of course, is aghast at the prospect of rolling the stone away. It's going to smell awful. And I find it interesting that it's only when the stone is rolled away that Jesus prays. Now, I've always been struck, and maybe you have too, that Jesus doesn't pray for Lazarus to rise. He doesn't even pray for the power to raise Lazarus. Instead, he thanks his Father. He thanks his Father for hearing his prayer and for the opportunity for the people witnessing this to believe in him. But we're left asking, or at least I'm left asking, what prayer? What prayer? Now, hang with me as I get to the answer. See, John has omitted this because I don't think he needs to put it in. When the stone is rolled back, there's no smell. And at that instant, Jesus knew Lazarus was alive. Death and decay had not taken him. And he knew that his prayers over the course of 2 days had been answered. And I believe it started with Jesus with the lack of smell. And I think, too, this is almost certainly the case, that in the prayer of thanksgiving to the Father, there lies another yet deeper meaning beyond what we read. It is thankfulness to God for raising Lazarus, but the deeper meaning is Jesus thanking the Father even through his tears, that this is the event that will send him to the cross. And through his own death and resurrection, many will come to believe in him. And of course, Lazarus comes out. The story ends. We ended at verse 45. At verse 46, the chief priests begin to conspire to kill him. This story has brought us to the doorstep of Holy Week, of Palm Sunday and Good Friday. In Lazarus, this story, a curtain has been drawn back and we glimpse what Jesus is about to face. It's a powerful story. Why doesn't God do something? If only things had been different. And yet there in the midst of our grief and our questions, John wants us to see the Word trying to point us to the future and to see that future coming, rushing into our present to greet us. But you know, this story has also been a story about the power of prayer. Prayer that lasted 2 days. I won't go into it, but in the prayer class last Wednesday, I ended up telling a story that I've told in other contexts about my mission trip to the DR in '94, where the guy who was leading it made us pray for hours on end. And I'm not talking about morning prayer, evening prayer, and all that stuff. I'm talking about sitting there waiting for God to speak. And it turned out to be the most spiritually powerful 10 days of my entire life. I think as Lazarus is unbound, we are being confronted with our own prayer life. And I think God might be asking us, how would things be different if only I prayed more? What things would spring into being if only I prayed more? How would God's future come bursting into our present if only we prayed more? Amen.